When a frontiersman's survival depended on every second, one man's idiotic invention changed the game. What seemed like a simple mistake became a tool that revolutionized butchering on the frontier, slashing work time by 5 times and saving lives in the process. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If these untold frontier stories ignite your passion for survival and innovation, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode brings even more incredible tales from the American wilderness. The cold morning air cut through the small, dimly lit cabin as Jacob Reeds stood over his latest butchering attempt. His breath, steady and controlled, created small clouds in the frozen room. The winter in the mountains of 1830 had already proven to be harsher than most years, and each hunt had become more taxing, the days stretching longer, the cold creeping further into his bones. Today, the task before him was no different from the countless others he'd faced as a settler, trying to carve out a life in the wilds of the American frontier. He needed meat, and a lot of it. It wasn't that Jacob hated the process. In fact, there was something comforting about the rhythm of his work. But with each passing year, the time it took to butcher a single animal seemed to stretch longer. The tools were crude, the space limited, and his body was showing the wear from the constant repetitive motion. It wasn't just the cold that wore him down, it was the endless work that felt more like an anchor around his neck than a chance to thrive. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, then grabbed his largest knife. The animal was large, a buck, thick with the winter fat that would keep his family fed for weeks. But even with all his experience, it would still take him hours to strip the meat and separate the usable parts. As he worked, he thought about the countless stories he'd heard of more seasoned trappers and settlers who too had wrestled with the same struggle. But Jacob's mind kept returning to one thing: survival. It was no longer just about making it through another day. It was about creating a system that could allow his family to thrive, not just endure. He couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to streamline the process. After all, every settler, every trapper faced the same challenges. Time was never on their side, and the days they spent butchering animals could be used for more vital survival tasks: wood cutting, repairing shelters, or scouting for more game. In the corner of the room, a worn workbench sat. His mind flashed to the makeshift table he had used to butcher the deer. It was sturdy enough, but it was far from efficient. The design, like most of his cabin, was a hodgepodge of necessity rather than innovation. And though Jacob had crafted every tool and piece of furniture in this cabin with care, none of them felt like they'd been made with the intent to save him time. He had come to believe that every problem had a solution, even if it was one that others would laugh at. With a sigh, he stepped away from the carcass for a moment, wiping his hands on his leather apron. He looked out the window at the dense, snow-covered forest. For a moment his mind wandered to the countless hours spent in the cold. He thought of his wife, Martha, who had tirelessly kept the cabin warm despite the winter chill, and their young daughter, who needed her father's strength. He couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The land had a way of taking what it wanted from you, and it didn't care who you were. But the spark of an idea flickered in Jacob's mind, a way to streamline the butchering process, to cut the time spent on each kill, and perhaps even make life a little easier for those around him. Jacob didn't sleep well that night. The image of the butchered buck, still fresh in his mind, hung like a shadow in the dark. He knew the process was inefficient, but it was more than that. Every time he had to deal with the meat, it was a reminder of how crude and rudimentary his tools were. The knives were blunt from hours of use, the surface of the table uneven and awkward for the type of work he had to do. But more than that, he realized the whole process was flawed in its design, at least the way he was going about it. The next morning, as the light streamed through the cracks in the cabin walls, Jacob moved quickly to gather his tools. He had an idea, and it wouldn't leave him. But it wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't a carpenter by trade. He wasn't even an inventor. But something inside him told him that the solution lay in simplicity, in making his butchering process something that flowed, that allowed him to work smarter, not harder. The table that stood in his cabin was the first place he'd consider. It was sturdy, but the angle was all wrong. Too many times he had to bend down, cramping his back as he carved the meat. It wasn't ideal. What if the angle of the table was different? What if the meat didn't have to lie flat, but could be tilted to give him a better approach? Jacob smiled to himself, feeling the spark of excitement he hadn't felt in weeks. It was as if the answer had been there all along, buried beneath the layers of hard work and exhaustion. He didn't know how it would work or how to make it, but the concept of a tilting table seemed the answer he'd been searching for. He spent the day gathering materials, scraps of wood, iron brackets from an old wagon, and even an old pulley system he had salvaged from a broken cart. He wasn't entirely sure how he was going to put it together, but he felt that he could make it work. His hands moved with a newfound energy, his mind racing with possibilities. Each moment felt like a step closer to solving the problem that had haunted him for so long. As the evening drew near, the cabin grew warmer with the fire crackling in the hearth. Jacob stood back and looked at the makeshift structure he had cobbled together. The tilting table was rough, but it was functional. It was set on a simple pivot system, allowing it to be adjusted to a variety of angles depending on the butchering task at hand. He couldn't help but grin. There was no way to know for sure if it would work, but he had a feeling that this simple, idiotic idea might just change everything. Jacob stood back, arms crossed, inspecting his creation. The tilting table, though rough and unfinished, seemed to hold potential. The hinges were secure, and the table shifted easily on the pivot. He was no engineer, but he understood the importance of simplicity, and this design, crude as it was, looked promising. It was now time to see if his vision could work in practice. His heart beat a little faster as he led the deer carcass from the cold storage room and placed it on the table. The meat still hung heavy with the scent of fresh blood, a reminder of the hunt that had kept his family alive through the brutal winter months. He had butchered dozens of animals, but this time felt different. There was a twinge of excitement in the air, as if the table itself might prove to be the breakthrough he'd been searching for. The design was simple, a series of wooden slats securely fastened to the frame with adjustable angles for the table surface. A mechanism that allowed the table to tilt would give him better leverage and a clearer line of sight when cutting. He could already imagine the ease with which he could work if it worked as he hoped. Jacob took a deep breath and set to work. He placed the meat on the table, and with a quick adjustment of the mechanism, tilted the surface to an angle that felt more natural. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to give him a better position to start his cuts. The first slice was clean and easy. Jacob paused for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. The angle felt right, better than any other butchering attempt he had ever made. The second cut followed just as smoothly. The knife slid through the meat effortlessly. For the first time, Jacob's hands didn't feel strained. The usual aches and tension in his shoulders were absent. As the table shifted with every cut, his body moved more naturally, almost instinctively. Each piece of meat seemed to fall neatly into place without forcing his arms into awkward positions. The tilt gave him freedom of movement, something he hadn't realized he was missing before. His excitement grew with each stroke of the blade. The entire process felt faster, more fluid. He was no longer fighting the table or his position. The work flowed in a way it never had before. The whole butchering task, from skinning to gutting to cutting the meat into portions, was easier. With each cut, Jacob felt a growing satisfaction. He had done it. The table wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a tool, one that was proving itself in the very task it was designed for. By the time the sun began to set, Jacob had butchered the entire deer in nearly half the time it would have taken using his old method. It wasn't just a small improvement, it was a revolution. For the first time, the endless, grueling task of butchering felt like a manageable chore. There was a sense of victory in his chest, but there was more than that. It was a quiet triumph, a small innovation that had the potential to change everything about his survival strategy on the frontier. Jacob stood up, wiping the blood from his hands with a cloth. He looked at the table one last time, his mind racing with possibilities. If this simple design could work so well for one man, surely it could do the same for others in the area, other trappers, other settlers who faced the same problems. This wasn't just a new way of butchering, it was a tool that could save precious time, something that would help the whole community. The days following Jacob's first successful test with the tilting table were filled with a quiet confidence. He spent his mornings hunting and his afternoons working on refining the table. There was no rush, no need for perfection. The table was already a success, and that knowledge gave him a sense of accomplishment that seemed to bolster his energy for the work ahead. As word of Jacob's innovation spread through the small settlement, people began to take notice. At first it was a passing curiosity, just another oddity from the local settler, but when a few of his neighbors came by to see the table for themselves, their initial skepticism turned into genuine interest. The promise of quicker, more efficient butchering was too enticing to ignore. One afternoon, as Jacob worked on the design, a trapper named Thomas came by to check on his progress. Thomas was a seasoned hunter who had spent years in the wilderness, but even he couldn't help but be intrigued by the strange contraption Jacob had built. "What's this, Jacob?" Thomas asked, eyeing the table curiously, as Jacob made adjustments to the pivot mechanism. "It's a tilting table for butchering," Jacob replied, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I designed it to make the process faster, more efficient." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "More efficient? How much faster can butchering a deer really get?" Jacob grinned, not missing the disbelief in Thomas's voice. "Come by tomorrow, and I'll show you," he said, his confidence growing. "I've got a fresh buck I'll be working on." The following day, as promised, Thomas returned, his interest piqued. Jacob had already set up the table, preparing for the butchering process. As Thomas watched, Jacob adjusted the angle of the table, placing the deer on the surface with ease. Within minutes, Thomas was captivated by the speed with which Jacob worked. The cuts were clean, precise, and the table allowed Jacob to move freely, adjusting the angle with every motion. Thomas's skepticism faded as he watched the process unfold before his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas muttered under his breath. "That's something else." Jacob didn't boast, but his pride was evident. "It makes the work easier, and it saves time. Time we can use for other things." Thomas paused, running a hand through his beard. "You've got something here, Jacob. You've got a way to make this frontier life a whole lot easier." By the end of the day, Thomas had promised to spread the word about the tilting table to the other settlers and trappers nearby. Jacob didn't expect it to be an overnight sensation, but he knew that if it worked for Thomas, it could work for others. The idea had legs, no doubt about it. In the following weeks, more and more people came to Jacob's cabin, curious to see the tilting table for themselves. Some came just to watch, others to try it out, and some came to offer suggestions for improvement. But the most important thing was that Jacob's invention was spreading. The people who had seen it for themselves now understood its value. It wasn't just an oddity, it was a practical solution to a very real problem. As the weeks turned into months, Jacob knew that his life was about to change. This idiotic invention, born out of necessity and ingenuity, was quickly becoming something far more important. It wasn't just about butchering, it was about building a community, about sharing knowledge that could help everyone survive. In the harsh and unforgiving wilderness of the frontier, that was a gift worth more than any pile of furs or gold. As the days passed, Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of the changes around him. His creation, the tilting table, had become more than just a tool. It had become a symbol of ingenuity and practicality on the frontier. People came from miles around to see it, each with their own questions, suggestions, and curiosity. What had started as a simple solution to his personal struggle with butchering was now a shared innovation that was quickly becoming part of the frontier's very fabric. The first real test came when Jacob received a letter from a neighboring settler named Abel. Abel's family had been living a few miles north of Jacob, deep in the thick of the wilderness. The harsh winter months had taken a toll on them, and the promise of a quicker, more efficient butchering method was too tempting to ignore. Abel's letter was direct. He needed Jacob's help to build one of these tables for himself. Jacob knew this moment would come sooner or later. He had been quietly hoping his invention would be adopted by others, but now that the demand was here, there was no turning back. He spent the next day preparing to make the journey. With the table packed into a sturdy wagon, he set off to Abel's homestead, his heart filled with both pride and nervous anticipation. Abel greeted him warmly, his wide grin revealing the excitement in his eyes. "I've heard nothing but good things, Jacob. I can't wait to see this for myself." Jacob nodded, his own grin growing wider. He set to work immediately, and over the next few hours he demonstrated how the table could be adjusted to different angles for various tasks. Abel watched intently, asking questions and marveling at the simplicity and effectiveness of the design. By the time the sun began to set, the table was ready, and Abel was eager to try it out. As they moved to the shed where Abel had his latest kill, Jacob couldn't help but notice the way Abel's wife Mary and their young son stood in the doorway watching with curiosity. They hadn't expected much more than a brief visit, but now they were witnessing firsthand the potential of Jacob's invention. Abel took the knife in his hand, and with a few simple adjustments, he placed the deer on the table, tilting it just enough to find a natural angle. His movements were fluid, and for the first time he wasn't straining with every cut. Jacob watched, both pleased and nervous. It was one thing to see the table work in his own cabin, but seeing it work in a stranger's hands felt like the true test. After just a few minutes, Abel stopped, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "This is incredible." The smile that spread across Jacob's face was more than just satisfaction. It was a quiet confirmation that his invention had indeed changed something fundamental about their lives. With that moment, Jacob understood that this wasn't just a personal achievement. It was something that could transform the way everyone on the frontier survived. The word of the tilting table spread quickly after that. Abel, now an avid supporter of the design, began telling everyone in his area. Soon, Jacob found himself traveling more frequently, building tables for other settlers, offering advice, and tweaking the design to fit their specific needs. His life was no longer centered on his own struggles. He had become an important part of a much larger community, united by the need to survive and improve their way of life. As the months passed, the demand for Jacob's tilting table grew, but so did the challenges. What had started as a simple solution to his personal problem had evolved into a full-fledged business, and with that came its own set of pressures. Jacob, who had once found solace in the quiet of his cabin, now found himself working day and night. He was no longer just a settler. He had become a craftsman, a problem solver, a symbol of innovation on the frontier. But with the increased attention, there also came a wave of doubts. For every person who marveled at the table, there were others who dismissed it as unnecessary or even foolish. Some of the older trappers, who had spent decades in the wilderness, scoffed at the idea of using such a fancy tool. "We've been getting by just fine without such nonsense," they would grumble, shaking their heads in disapproval. Jacob had expected some resistance, but the degree to which some of the settlers rejected the idea surprised him. He had thought that the practicality of the invention would speak for itself. But the more people he met, the more he realized that change was not always welcomed with open arms. Even Abel, who had initially been eager to adopt the new design, had begun to show signs of doubt. "You know, Jacob," Abel had said one evening, his voice uncertain, "some of the others are starting to talk. They think you're making things more complicated than they need to be." Jacob felt a pang of frustration. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such criticisms, but it stung nonetheless. "You've seen how much time it saves," Jacob replied, his voice steady but his heart racing. "And it makes the job easier on the body. It's not just about speed, it's about doing it without killing yourself." Abel scratched his beard thoughtfully, his eyes clouded with indecision. "I know, but there's something about the old way. It's how it's always been done." Jacob stared at the ground for a moment, his mind racing. He understood the argument, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing in the way of something bigger. The frontier was a place of constant adaptation, and if they didn't adapt, they would be left behind. Over the following weeks, Jacob continued to refine his design, making it more durable, easier to transport, and less cumbersome. He wasn't deterred by the criticisms. Instead, he saw them as a challenge, an opportunity to prove that the innovation he had introduced could withstand the scrutiny of time. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder how many others would eventually come to see the truth in his invention. How many would embrace it, and how many would continue to reject it, clinging to the past for comfort. But one thing was certain: Jacob wasn't backing down. He had seen firsthand how much this invention could change the way people lived, and he wasn't going to let the voices of a few naysayers stop him. The frontier was a place of constant struggle, but it was also a place where ingenuity could thrive. And Jacob was determined to see his creation succeed. By the end of the year, Jacob's tilting table had earned a reputation far beyond the reaches of his immediate neighbors. Word had spread like wildfire through the frontier communities, each letter, each messenger, bringing news of the revolutionary invention. Yet, as with every innovation, there were still those who dismissed it as a passing fad, something too fancy for the harsh utilitarian demands of frontier life. But even the most stubborn of old trappers couldn't ignore the practical results that Jacob's table produced. It was not just a tool, it was a lifeline. In the months following the table's success, Jacob began to notice a subtle shift in the way people saw him. No longer just a simple settler, struggling to make it through the wilds, Jacob had become a sort of local hero, a symbol of the frontier spirit that thrived on innovation, resilience, and community. It wasn't just the table that had made him notable. It was his willingness to share it with everyone, to make sure the entire community could benefit from his work. But with success came new challenges. Jacob had never imagined his creation would spark such interest, and he quickly found himself overwhelmed by the requests. More settlers, trappers, and farmers came to him, eager to see his design firsthand. Some brought timber and tools, hoping Jacob would craft a table for them on the spot. Others simply wanted to observe and learn, seeking to replicate the design on their own. He had underestimated the demand, and the pressure to meet it began to weigh on him. One morning, Jacob found himself sitting at the table, the map of the surrounding region spread out before him. He'd been thinking about his future, about what this invention might mean for him and his family in the long run. Perhaps he thought it was time to take this beyond the local community. If people in his area found the table useful, surely others farther out west could benefit from it as well. The idea of moving from simply a craftsman to a full-fledged inventor, someone whose work could change the way people survived in the wilderness, started to take root in Jacob's mind. He had learned the lessons of hard work and humility from years spent on the frontier, but he now found himself standing at the precipice of something new, something larger than he had ever dreamed. The possibilities seemed endless, but so did the risks. Could he leave behind his small, settled life and venture into unknown territories, selling his design? Would the table be embraced by other regions, or would it be just another tool quickly forgotten once the next innovation came along? Martha, his wife, noticed the change in Jacob. The late nights spent hunched over his workbench had become more frequent. She could see the spark of ambition in his eyes, but she also saw the strain. "Jacob," she said one evening, as they sat by the fire, "what are you thinking? This is more than we ever expected." Jacob paused, studying the flames as they danced in the hearth. "I think it's time to take a leap," he said quietly. "I've done all I can here. It's time to show the world what this can do." Martha didn't hesitate. "Then we'll go together. Wherever this takes us, we'll face it as a family." It was that simple, unspoken bond that gave Jacob the courage he needed. With Martha's support, he began planning for the journey ahead, one that would take him far beyond the familiar landscape of their mountain home. Jacob and Martha packed their belongings into a sturdy cart, ready to leave the quiet life they had built in the mountains. The decision to venture west had been difficult, but Jacob knew it was the right one. As much as he cherished the life they had built, he knew there was more waiting for them beyond the familiar frontier. He had a vision now, one that went beyond butchering tables. It was about sharing his work with the world, building a reputation not just for his innovation, but for the spirit of the frontier itself. They traveled through valleys and over rivers, their journey taking them through small settlements and isolated outposts where people had heard of Jacob's invention, but had yet to see it in person. The world outside their little cabin was much larger than Jacob had imagined. Each stop along the way presented new opportunities, and Jacob found himself demonstrating his table for those curious enough to ask. Sometimes it was an old trapper who had heard whispers of the invention. Other times it was a young settler eager to make life easier on the frontier. At each settlement, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were amazed by the practicality of the design and the ease with which Jacob's invention sped up the butchering process. Word continued to spread, and soon Jacob found himself in demand across the region. He worked tirelessly to meet requests for new tables, often staying up late into the night, carving, cutting, and assembling each piece with the same care he had used when building his first table back at his cabin. But as the days passed and the journey stretched on, Jacob began to understand the true weight of his decision. While the work was rewarding, it was also exhausting. The physical labor, combined with the constant travel, began to take a toll on him, and yet there was something invigorating about seeing his invention in use by so many people. Each time a settler thanked him or a trapper marveled at the ingenuity of the design, Jacob felt a quiet sense of pride swell within him. This wasn't just about making money, it was about changing the lives of people who, like him, were simply trying to survive. Martha, ever his partner in this journey, stood by his side, offering encouragement when his resolve began to waver. She helped him set up the tables, demonstrated how they worked, and kept the fires burning when the long days seemed to drain Jacob of all his energy. "We've come this far," she would remind him, her voice always steady. "We've made a difference, and we'll keep making one." One evening, as they camped near a stream under a sky filled with stars, Jacob sat beside Martha, feeling the weight of his accomplishments. He thought about how far they had come since the first day he had tinkered with that simple, tilting table. And now, as the journey stretched on, he realized this was only the beginning. There was a whole new world out there, one that was just beginning to understand what he had created. For the first time in his life, Jacob felt like the frontier was not just a place he had survived. It was a place where he could thrive, a place where his innovation had the potential to shape the lives of countless others. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Jacob knew one thing: he was ready for whatever came next. The future had never looked so clear. Jacob had never expected the road ahead to be smooth, but nothing had prepared him for the challenges that began to surface as they reached the more established settlements. At first, things had gone well. People were eager to see the tilting table and amazed at how much easier their lives could be. But as the weeks passed, Jacob began to encounter resistance he hadn't anticipated. In a larger town along the river, Jacob set up shop for a few days, hoping to generate interest in his tables. He had already sold a handful to the locals, and business was booming, but something felt off. One afternoon, a well-dressed man approached him, his eyes sharp with skepticism. "So, this is your invention?" the man asked, examining the table closely, his arms crossed. "That's right," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "It makes butchering more efficient. It can save hours of work, especially in these cold months." The man frowned. "It's a clever design, but I don't think it'll last. You can't change the way we've always done things. People around here aren't looking for newfangled gadgets." The man's words struck Jacob harder than he expected. He had been so caught up in the excitement of spreading his invention that he hadn't considered the skepticism of some people. It wasn't just about practicality. It was about tradition, and many settlers were resistant to anything that seemed like a departure from the tried-and-true methods of survival. As Jacob stood there watching the man walk away, a feeling of doubt crept into his mind. Perhaps he had underestimated the deep-rooted way of life these people had built. Maybe the tilting table wasn't the revolution he had hoped it would be. That night, Jacob sat beside the fire, lost in thought. The fire crackled in front of him, casting dancing shadows on the walls of their small shelter. Martha sat next to him, sensing the weight on his mind. "What's bothering you, Jacob?" she asked, her voice soft. Jacob hesitated for a moment before answering. "The man today. He's right, isn't he? Maybe I've been too eager. Maybe I'm trying to change things that don't need changing." Martha shook her head. "No, Jacob. You created something that helps. You've seen it work, and so have others. But change isn't always easy, and it doesn't happen overnight." Her words cut through his uncertainty. She was right. The world on the frontier was harsh, but it was also a place where ideas could take root and grow. Jacob had seen how much the tilting table had already improved life for so many. The old ways were powerful, but they weren't always the best ways. With renewed conviction, Jacob made a decision. He would keep going, no matter the setbacks. His invention wasn't just about the table. It was about showing others that there was always room for improvement, for progress. The frontier was built on survival, but it was also built on adaptation. "I'm not giving up," Jacob said, looking up at the stars above. "The table will make a difference. I just have to keep pushing."